more than 100 unique styles of beer, each with their own set of ingredients, process, guidelines, history, and experience. If you're a beer lover, an industry leader, or somewhere in between, a better knowledge of beer style will improve your life and your work.
Welcome to A Sense of Beer Style, essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. I'm Julia Herz.
And I'm Jeremy Storton.
We're advanced Cicerones, beer judges, home brewers, and we're excited to guide you through the vast and wonderful world of beer styles.
And I believe you are on deck to talk about water, the
Yes.
number one ingredient in beer.
Yeah, so let's get at water. And I think it's really helpful and important to say that when I sat for Master Cicerone, of which I've done multiple times, one day we could just do a whole show on that journey. This literally in my notes, I have, the way I studied is I had this huge PowerPoint. Any topic, I just do a title. And the one when it comes to water is the water essay, exclamation point. And then there's like 8 slides. Because I'm not chemistry minded. I just don't, have that gene, and really in schooling and growing up, I never followed that, or, the world of chemistry is a little beyond me. So it was a really hard topic to wrap my brain around. And I'm proud to have kind of gotten a handle on how to describe water. So I proudly didn't shy away from Jeremy and I assigning me this one, even though behind the scenes, Jeremy, I was like, oh, the water essay. It just is what it is. Water's beer's mostly water. That's the easy way to put it, right? Water chemistry really does matter when it comes to beer. There's minerals and ions, and you will note if you look at actual homebrew or commercial recipes for beer that there's often water profile adjustment to mimic the original brewers or style trends of the water that led to that one beer. And so adjustment is very common. You're good, Jeremy?
Yeah.
So adjustment is very common from water when you are brewing. We also pay attention in beer to not just the chemistry, but, the pH. There's the more alkaline, the more acidic, and the basic. For anyone that studied the pH scale, if you're brewing, by the way, you're looking for mash temperatures in the 5 point whatever range. And then your final, pH levels for most beer styles, by the way, are in the 4s, the low 4s. That's certainly out the window if you don't worry about beer styles and you think about other things. But it is a real helpful component when you start to think about beer, its mouthfeel, and how it tastes is a direct result, not just of the water, the minerals, and the ion in that water, but the pH and the titratable acidity. You've heard that maybe concept from wine. So we pay attention to that in brewing and water as an ingredient. The minerals that I mentioned can commonly be carbonate, right? Calcium, magnesium, sulfate. And each one of these will make the water harder, softer, or add components to the flavor. So I think that's super fun to really pay attention to. You can definitely geek out on water though. And like I said, I've got those, 8 slides that really were trying to prepare me. But from a higher level, it's the most prolific. Beer is mostly water ingredient. And many people, when they brew beer, are paying attention to the water composition of that actual water.
And I think it's interesting to note too, with all these, all the salts in there, in some of the classes that I've had, it was basically described to kind of get a good understanding of water is you're not going to get a lot of flavor directly from the water, unless it's chlorinated water. You get some chlorophenols that taste like Band-Aids and buckets and good old fashioned old school Listerine type of stuff. You can get those flavors from that. But if you have just water, all these salts and ions and solute that's in the water, it doesn't necessarily add a flavor necessarily, but it helps bring out your malt flavors. It helps bring out your hop flavors. In fact, I recently brewed Maibach in a Belgian double, and I used reverse osmosis water that was completely stripped of everything because I'm in a very hard water area. And I added calcium chloride because I wanted to. I think of it as like if you have a camera and you're trying to bring something into clearer focus. The calcium chloride will bring the malt into clearer focus. The sulfates will bring the hops bitterness into more focus. And so this is where when you start playing with the water or start studying water profiles from different famous regions like Burton-on-Trent and Munich and particularly Pilsen, then you start having an understanding of how these beers start manifesting and what gives them that character that they have. This is unless you're really into chemistry and science and all that stuff, which I mildly am. To me, this is just fascinating to see how these beers manifest because of the water.
It's a great addition to what I shared, and you trigger also too, not just from those minerals and ions do you get flavor profile, but the example of being in the shower at your home and you're used to the hardness or softness of that water based on the level of ions, that determines how slick your skin is with the soap easily washing off or feeling like it's still sitting on top of your skin, right? And if you go travel to a conference or on a journey somewhere and you're in a different shower or bathtub and you soap up and the water all of a sudden is opposite what you're used to, well, then you are definitely experiencing the difference between, hard water and soft water as a true example. And if you apply that to beer, that affects the mouthfeel. And I think about the difference between German style Pilsner, right? And then the Czech Bohemian style Pils. Czech Bohemian style is a great example of the lowest ion content area in the world, or one of them. And so it's very soft water. And that's why you get that softer sense of mouthfeel. But German Pils are much more crisp. The bitterness is accentuated from the hardness of that water, and a lot of the flavor components are water derived. So those are two good, beer style examples of kind of what we're triggering here and some of the differences of water.
Yeah. So basically, don't dismiss the value of water. I mean, it is more than just an ingredient. It adds so much to the sensory process. But speaking of process, let's talk about, I'm going to try to, within minutes, describe the complexity of the brewing process. We've talked about each ingredient very simply, and no matter if you are a mega commercial brewer, a small craft brewer, or a home brewer, the process is still pretty much the same. You're going to start with, and keep in mind that the temperature of your water makes a big difference. Even just 2 degrees off is a very different type of beer. But when we start with brewing, we're going to take, we talked about the malted barley. We're going to crack those things open. We're not going to crush them like espresso coffee beans. We're going to crack them open so we can get at those starches. We're going to put all that into a vessel with a very specific temperature of water, let's say 150 degrees Fahrenheit for this example. And we're going to let that sit anywhere from 30 minutes to 60 minutes because we want to basically turn that malted barley. We're going to let the enzymes that exist in that barley to convert those starches to sugars. And then we're going to take those sugars and basically turn that into a malt tea. And that's what the mashing process is. Then we're going to separate that water out from that. We're going to rinse some hot water through that to get all the sugars we can, but we're going to separate that water from the grain, and then we're going to start to boil it. There's a lot of reasons why we want to boil the wort. And again, it's now called wort at this point, W-O-R-T. We're going to use that to clarify, to get the hot break and coagulate all the proteins. We're going to use that to cultivate color and flavor. We're going to use that to get rid of compounds that want to make it very sulfury. And so there's a lot of reasons why we're going to boil this, not to mention sanitization. Next, we're going to start talking about hops. If you want to create a bitter beer, then you want to put the hops in at the very beginning of your boil. And an average boil is about 60 minutes. So if you put the hops in at 60 minutes, then you're going to end up with more bitterness. If you put hops in toward the very end, last 10 minutes, or at the very, very end as you're turning off the heat, then you're going to get more aroma and flavor. For anyone who loves New England IPAs, there's very low bitterness, but just nothing but just these wonderful tropical fruit flavors. A lot of the times they will get done with their boil. They will move that to the whirlpool and they will do what's called hop bursting, and they will put all the hops in then to get to get very little bitterness, but all the aroma and all the flavor. So you can really play with the amount of bitterness and the amount of flavor that you get out of it. So after your boil, then we need to take, obviously it's very, very hot. We need to chill that down so that we can then, if you stick it into a whirlpool as a commercial brewer, you're just clarifying and getting rid of some of the leftover solute that's in that liquid. If you're a home brewer, you may not have that luxury, but you're still going to chill that down, because next we need to take that yeast and pitch it into that cooled down wort. Send it off to a primary fermenter. It could be a big stainless steel fermenter as a commercial brewer, or a 5-6 gallon glass carboy if you're a home brewer. We're going to let that ferment and do its thing. And when it's done, typically it will go on into a secondary fermentation or a bright tank, so it can clarify further. It can finish off getting rid of some of these other flavor compounds that you may not want in there, that we'll talk about it another time. And after it's done clarifying, we'll typically cool it down and just help all the rest of that solute drop out of solution. And then it's ready for bottling. It's ready for kegging. It's ready to serve at the bar. And that is the quick overview of the brewing process. Julia, do you want to add anything?
I do, and I hedged my bets here by saying, people spend months and years learning the brewing process. So keep that in mind. But back to what is beer, the process matters. And basically the brewing and conditioning process, which I will add, brewers use a wide variety of techniques to modify the brewing process. Sometimes brewers play with, variable mashing, steeping temperatures, unique fermentation temperatures, multiple yeast additions, barrel aging and blending, dry hopping, bottle conditioning. Those are all things that really kind of add to the brewing process, in addition to what Jeremy shared, and kind of maybe to repackage and even reinforce what Jeremy shared. And this is classic Cicerone training. If you get their workbooks or, go through any of their teachings, they'll talk about hot side and cold side on the brewing process. And so I'm just going to trigger this lexicon for you. And a lot of my and Jeremy's show in this A Sense of Beer style approach is to get your head in the game if you've never heard these concepts. And then, yes, you too, like us, will go down the rabbit hole to fully own and understand these concepts. But in expectation form, it's not fair to have to truly, in one episode, have you fully understand the brewing process and be able to articulate back all the concepts tied to it. But I think this has always been helpful, so I kind of went to my cheat sheet. And on the hot side of the brewing process is milling, steeping and mashing, lautering, or law for sparging, boil, whirlpool, and cool, right? And that's all with the heat involved, tied to when you're exposing the heat and the hops and the ingredients to warm temperatures. Then the cold side, when you have cooled your beverage, which is now beer, you've gone from wort to beer, as Jeremy explained. You're now pitching yeast into it. You're fermenting it. You're now conditioning and maturing it to reduce fermentation byproducts, maybe like diacetyl or sulfur or acetaldehyde. Then you're clarifying it, adding finings, letting it settle. You're carbonating it naturally, often, or you're adding carbonation. Then you package it and you pasteurize it. And that list of two things, hot side, cold side, is a good kind of the big picture overview of what I always kind of fall back on.
Yeah, this topic in itself is definitely one of those, but wait, there's more situations. Totally. It can get very vast, and there's lots of, as you alluded to, a lot of different techniques that create different mouthfeels, different textures, different things. And we'll talk about those later and as they come up. But bottom line, that this is the basic process of making beer, which is not terribly unlike making bread if you really kind of think about the crossover. So that's a good analogy for anyone who's trying to think about it. Just bread is more solid, beer is more liquid, and otherwise there's a lot of similarity, just for the sake of discussion.
Totally. And then, Jeremy, I fought for this one to be in our list to cover on what is beer. And so I love that we've assigned it to you. Carbonation to me is a ingredient in beer.
Yeah,
absolutely. If you're, adding CO2, carbon dioxide from a gas tank and a gas company, because you're a brewer, delivered that can be tainted, right? It can influence the flavor in negative ways. It's not just a byproduct of yeast fermentation, where yeast eat sugars, and a lot of enzymatic reactions are happening in this and that. But then yeast give us carbonation and alcohol. But it's an ingredient added to beer deliberately sometimes. So I'd love, Jeremy, for you to overview carbonation.
Yeah. So whenever I try to explain this to my children, I say that the yeast, remember, it's a living organism. It's a single cell sugar fungus. I tell my kids that when carbonation happens, it's excreting alcohol and farting carbon dioxide, and so that's how we get alcohol and bubbles. So when we talk about carbonation, it is a naturally occurring thing within beer. Sometimes you get it in some wines as well. So that's why you get a little bit of fizz. And carbonation is not just a singular linear thing. I mean, you can get the carbonation when you think about the sensory aspect of it and just the way that feels in your mouth, I can imagine you have these tiny single cell organisms that are like stabbing your palate with knives, like Drax from Guardians of the Galaxy. Or you can have in some fantastic French champagnes that I've tried, they just taste like pillowy marshmallows that are just very gently like patting your palate. So you have a different experience with different carbonations. But when we talk about carbonation, it occurs naturally, and you'll typically, if you ever have an opportunity to try a cask ale, then people always consider that warm, flat beer. It is neither warm nor is it flat. It's a completely different experience that should be enjoyed. But that they don't add any carbonation to that. Typically, most commercial beers, most home brews, they add extra carbonation to that. And when we measure that, and when we think about different styles and how much carbonation they have, we often talk about it in as far as volumes of CO2. And the way that I want you to think about that is, imagine a single container, whatever container you want to think of. I'm going to think of a keg in this example. If you were to fill that keg from bottom to top with carbon dioxide so that it is full, you have 1 volume of CO2. But of course, carbon dioxide is a gas and it can be compressed. So if you were to then compress 2 of those volumes of CO2 into that keg, now it is 2 volumes of CO2. And that's roughly where the average beer is. If we're talking American Pale Ale or Amber or IPA, we're right around 2 to 2.5 volumes of CO2. If we're talking about Berliner Weiss, then we could be getting up to 4 volumes of CO2. If we're talking Lambic, we could be talking about 1 to 1.5 volumes of CO2. But just understand, if you hear that terminology, volumes of CO2, that's what that describes. And our general average across the board is probably 2.5 volumes of CO2. Is that anything you want to add to that, Julia?
Great overview for sure. And, triggering onto the concept of gas and what's going on is a really important topic, because it's not just an ingredient in beer, but it ties to flavor, as I mentioned. And then also within draft systems, which the majority of beer, frankly, that people will enjoy at restaurants is on draft, it ties to the balance of that draft system. So that's a whole nother thing to kind of plant the seed on. But what I would like to reinforce, right, is the visual notion of carbonation is one version of how we sense carbonation in a beer as judges and then and appreciators. And then the palate side, right, on the mouthfeel side, how we sense carbonation. So, the most beer style guidelines that I've come across, although we, in my view, account for it on craftbeer.com and the A to Z of beer styles that I, helped lead in authoring, and created the deductive tasting method for beer, A to Z. And if you work your way through A, B, and C, and then you get to C, one of the C's is carbonation visual. So I would have the categories of none, slow, medium, fast rising bubbles is the way to describe what I'm visually able to then translate and communicate to somebody else. So that's good, but you're not going to see the mention of that in your style guidelines. And I do think it's really important to remember that, it lends body or weight to the beer. And on the tongue, it stimulates our trigeminal nerves. And there's a great geeky term for you to go down the rabbit hole on, right? And it gives us that sense of, temperature, texture, or ties into the temperature, texture, and pain sensing, the trigeminal nerve of our human system. And it triggers that. Carbonation also can be detected as an aroma. I'm very sensitive to carbonic acid.
I was just gonna mention that.
Yeah, so when I'm judging beer, I will say, essence of carbonic acid. If you overcarbonate, sometimes you really get that like leaching of acid from the CO2. So it affects the appearance and then also the mouthfeel. And then it also obviously contributes to the color of foam. And then there's nitrogen. That's a whole nother topic in carbonation. So, carbonation can be naturally occurring, produced, as we said, as a yeast fermentation byproduct, or added to beer under pressure. And nitrogen on that topic can be added to beer, providing smaller bubbles and a softer mouthfeel compared to CO2.
Yeah, and that whole nitrogen topic, that was something I figured we could bring up at another time as well, because that has just a fantastic history and story and sensory example of its own, especially when we get to Irish stouts. We need to talk about that. But it's funny you brought up that carbonic pop. I'm quite sensitive to that too, and it's almost like for me the experience is getting a little bit of like tin and citric acid at the same time, and every once in a while I'll get that, and that is just the experience of that carbonation, and it's kind of interesting.
So I want to bring us home and do work to close it here. I like everything we've covered to get your heads in the game. Another time we'll cover the difference between nuance in brewing process, the difference between commercial and home brewing. But I really feel like in this concise, hopefully 20 minutes or whatever we are for time, you've gotten a sense, if you didn't know anything of how to describe beer, how to higher level do it, and how to go down that rabbit hole of geekdom. But to kind of sum it all up, what is beer? Beer is a fermented beverage from mostly malted grains. It contains malted grains, hops, often depending on the style, or herbs and spices, yeast, water, carbonation, and a little love and care from the brewing process will also influence everything that you are tasting in the glass, and can be take you down the range of barrel aging for beers, for example. So there's so much nuance into what is beer, but that's our spin on it. Anything else, Jeremy, before we close this prepisode out?
No, that we did a very thorough job of a general overview, if there's such a thing. But again, you may have questions after this. That's okay. This is just meant to be the beginning of going down that rabbit hole of what brewing is, the ingredients. There's so much more to learn. I know there are a lot of great books out there if you want to learn. I've spent a lot of time talking to people about different ingredients with my podcast at Good Beer Matters. So please go find those episodes and learn more about that as well. Anything you want to share before we're done?
Nope, I'm ready to say goodbye and thanks. And if you made it to the end of this episode, super jazzed to have you listen to it on our overview of what is beer.
Yeah, goodbye, thanks, and of course, cheers.
Thank you for listening to A Sense of Beer Style, the essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. With advanced Cicerones, me, Julia,
And me, Jeremy.
Tune into the next episode as we continue exploring the world of beer styles and what to make of them. We encourage you to listen to the Prepisodes to build your foundation and better understand beer styles.
And before the next episode, I'd like to ask you to review the show and let us know what you'd like featured in upcoming episodes. Until next time, here's to you and your sense of beer style. Thank you for listening. Cheers.